Welcome to Sleepy Philosophy, where the deepest questions of human existence are explored in the gentlest of ways. Tonight we embark on a tranquil journey through some of philosophy's most beautiful paradoxes, those curious contradictions that have puzzled brilliant minds for centuries. These are not the harsh debates of academic halls, but soft explorations of ideas that dance at the edges of logic, inviting us to wonder rather than worry, to drift rather than debate. Before we begin our gentle descent into these philosophical mysteries, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from tonight. Whether it's a quiet evening in Venice or the early hours in Montreal, you're welcome here in this peaceful corner of contemplation. If you find comfort in these philosophical wanderings, a gentle tap on the like button helps more weary minds discover this sanctuary of thought. And if you'd like to join our community of sleepy philosophers, the subscribe button awaits your drowsy consideration. So settle in, let your breathing slow, and prepare to encounter ideas that are both impossibly complex and beautifully simple. Tonight, we explore paradoxes not as problems to be solved, but as gentle companions for the journey into sleep. These contradictions that have captivated philosophers for millennia will accompany you as your mind softens, and your thoughts begin to float like leaves on a quiet stream. The word paradox comes from the ancient Greek, meaning contrary to expectation. These are ideas that seem to contradict themselves yet reveal profound truths about the nature of reality, knowledge, and existence. They are the philosophical equivalent of optical illusions, showing us that our everyday understanding of the world might be far more mysterious than we imagine. Think of paradoxes as riddles without neat answers, poems written in the language of logic, or mirrors that reflect not our faces but the curious nature of thought itself. They invite us to embrace uncertainty, to find peace in questions that have no simple solutions, and to discover that sometimes the most profound truths emerge not from answers, but from the gentle contemplation of impossibilities. Our first philosophical companion tonight is known as the paradox of the heap, a puzzle so ancient that it was already old when Aristotle was young. Imagine, if you will, a single grain of sand resting on a table before you. Clearly one grain does not make a heap. Now add another grain. Still not a heap. Add a third, a fourth, a 10th grain. At what point exactly does this collection of individual grains transform into what we would call a heap? The puzzle deepens as we continue adding grains. 100 grains might not seem like a heap to some, while others might disagree. 1,000 grains feels more substantial, yet the question remains elusive. When does the transformation occur? At grain number 5,847? At 10,000? The paradox suggests that if one grain is not a heap, and adding a single grain to a non-heap cannot create a heap, then no collection of grains, no matter how vast, could ever constitute a heap. Yet we know that heaps exist. We see them on beaches, in construction sites, in the gentle mounds of autumn leaves. The paradox reveals something beautiful about the fuzzy boundaries of our everyday concepts. Life is filled with such gradual transformations that resist precise definition. When does day become night? When does a child become an adult? When does a collection of notes become a melody? This ancient puzzle invites us to consider how much of our experience exists in these liminal spaces, these gentle transitions where one thing gradually becomes another. There is something deeply soothing about accepting that precision is not always possible or even necessary. The heap exists in the space between certainty and uncertainty, just as sleep exists in the gentle transition between waking and dreams. As we drift deeper into our exploration, we encounter another paradox that has puzzled minds for over 2,000 years. Zeno of Elea, a philosopher from ancient Greece, presented a series of paradoxes that challenge our basic understanding of motion and time. The most famous of these involves Achilles, the swift-footed hero of Greek legend, racing against a tortoise. In this race, the tortoise is given a head start. Zeno argued that Achilles, despite his legendary speed, could never overtake the tortoise. His reasoning unfolds like a gentle mathematical poem. When Achilles reaches the point where the tortoise began, the tortoise has moved slightly ahead. When Achilles reaches that new position, the tortoise has advanced again, albeit by a smaller distance. This process continues infinitely, with Achilles always approaching but never quite reaching the tortoise. The paradox suggests that motion itself might be impossible, that what we perceive as movement is actually an infinite series of static positions. Yet we know that faster runners do overtake slower ones, that arrows do reach their targets, that rivers do flow to the sea. The beauty of Zeno's paradox lies not in its literal truth, but in its invitation to contemplate the mysterious nature of continuity and change. Modern mathematics has provided tools to resolve this paradox through the concept of infinite series that converge to finite values, yet the philosophical questions it raises remain as profound as ever. How do we move from one moment to the next? How does time itself flow? These are questions that invite contemplation rather than demanding answers, puzzles that soothe rather than agitate. In the quiet space between Achilles and the tortoise, between motion and stillness, we find a metaphor for the gentle pursuit of goals that seem always just beyond our reach. Perhaps the beauty lies not in the reaching, but in the eternal approach, the infinite journey toward understanding that never quite arrives, but enriches every step along the way. Our next companion is a paradox that emerges from the realm of knowledge itself, a gentle puzzle known as the paradox of the preface. Imagine an author who has spent years researching and writing a comprehensive book on a complex subject. In the main text, they present hundreds of claims with confidence, backed by careful research and thoughtful analysis. Yet in the preface, as is common and humble practice, they acknowledge that despite their best efforts, the book undoubtedly contains errors. Here lies the contradiction. The author simultaneously believes each individual claim in their book, while also believing that some of those claims are false. They are certain of each statement, yet uncertain of the whole. This creates a peculiar logical situation where rational belief seems to lead to contradiction. The paradox extends far beyond academic publishing into the very nature of human knowledge. We hold countless beliefs about the world around us, from simple facts about our daily routines to complex understanding about science, history, and human nature. We feel confident about each individual belief, yet we know from experience that some of our beliefs must be mistaken. We are fallible creatures in an uncertain world. This paradox invites us to embrace a beautiful form of intellectual humility. It suggests that wisdom lies not in the certainty of our individual beliefs, but in the recognition of our overall fallibility. There is something deeply peaceful about accepting that we can be both confident and humble, certain and uncertain, knowledgeable and aware of our ignorance. In the gentle space between confidence and doubt, we find room for growth, learning, and the kind of open-minded curiosity that makes philosophical exploration possible. The paradox of the preface reminds us that the most profound truth might be our acknowledgement that absolute truth often remains just beyond our grasp. As we continue our sleepy philosophical journey, we encounter a paradox that touches the very heart of personal identity. The Ship of Theseus presents a puzzle about what makes something the same thing over time. According to ancient accounts, the ship that carried Theseus and the youth of Athens back from Crete was preserved by the Athenians, who gradually replaced its old planks with new timber as they decayed. The question emerges like morning mist over still water. If every original plank is eventually replaced, is it still the same ship? The vessel, the same name, yet contains none of its looks the same, serves the same function, bears original material. At what point, if any, does it cease to be the Ship of Theseus and become something else entirely? The philosopher Thomas Hobbes added another layer to this puzzle. What if someone collected all the original planks as they were removed and used them to reconstruct a ship identical to the original? Which would be the true Ship of Theseus, the continuously maintained vessel, or the reconstructed one made from original materials? This ancient puzzle resonates deeply with questions of personal identity. The cells in our bodies are constantly being replaced, yet we consider ourselves the same person throughout our lives. Our thoughts, beliefs, and memories change over time, sometimes dramatically, yet we maintain a sense of continuous identity. What makes you the same person you were 10 years ago? What will make you the same person 10 years from now? The Ship of Theseus invites us to consider whether identity lies in physical continuity, functional continuity, or something more mysterious and ineffable. Perhaps identity is not a fixed property, but a gentle process, a river that maintains its name while its waters are never the same from moment to moment. In contemplating this paradox, we find a soothing acceptance of change as fundamental to existence. We are not static beings but dynamic processes, ships being continuously rebuilt while somehow remaining ourselves. There is comfort in recognizing that transformation and identity can coexist, that we can change profoundly while remaining essentially who we are. These paradoxes we have explored tonight are not merely intellectual curiosities, but gentle invitations to embrace the mysterious nature of existence. They remind us that reality is far richer and more complex than our everyday thinking might suggest. In their contradictions, we find not confusion but wonder, not problems but poetry, written in the language of logic. As we prepare to delve even deeper into the realm of philosophical paradoxes, remember that these puzzles are companions for contemplation, not problems demanding urgent solutions. They offer us permission to rest in uncertainty, to find peace in questions that have no easy answers, and to discover that sometimes the most profound insights emerge not from resolution, but from the gentle embrace of mystery. Let these ideas settle softly in your mind as we prepare to encounter even more fascinating contradictions that have captured the imagination of thinkers across the centuries. The journey into philosophical paradox is just beginning, and the mysteries ahead promise to be as beautiful as they are bewildering. Our next philosophical companion emerges from the realm of truth itself, a paradox so elegantly simple, yet devastatingly complex that it has troubled logicians for centuries. The liar paradox presents itself with deceptive innocence. Consider this statement. This sentence is false. If the statement is true, then it must be false, as it claims. But if it is false, then it must be true, since it accurately describes itself as false. We find ourselves caught in an endless loop, a logical whirlpool where truth and falsehood chase each other in eternal circles. The ancient Greeks discovered this paradox in various forms. Epimenides, the Cretan, supposedly declared that all Cretans are liars. If he spoke the truth, then as a Cretan he must be lying, making his statement false. But if he was lying, then perhaps not all Cretans are liars, which could make his statement true. The contradiction spirals endlessly, like a snake consuming its own tail. This paradox reveals something profound about the nature of language and self-reference. We live in a world where statements can refer to themselves, where meaning can fold back upon itself in ways that create impossible situations. There is something beautifully mysterious about this quality of language, this ability for words to create logical mirages that shimmer at the edges of understanding. The liar paradox invites us to consider the limits of logical systems, the places where neat categories of true and false begin to blur and dissolve. Perhaps truth itself is not as binary as we imagine. Perhaps there are statements that exist in the twilight between truth and falsehood, in the gentle spaces where certainty gives way to wonder. As we drift further into the landscape of philosophical puzzles, we encounter the paradox that bears the name of a medieval philosopher, Buridan's ass. This thought experiment presents us with a perfectly rational donkey standing exactly equidistant between two identical piles of hay. The donkey is equally hungry for both piles, equally attracted to each, with no rational basis for choosing one over the other. According to the logic of the paradox, the donkey would be unable to choose and would therefore starve to death, frozen by the perfect symmetry of its situation. Yet this conclusion seems absurd. Real donkeys do not starve when faced with equivalent choices. They move, they choose, they act, often seemingly without elaborate rational calculation. The paradox illuminates the peculiar relationship between reason and action in our daily lives. We often face situations where rational analysis provides no clear guidance, where the options before us seem equally valid or equally problematic. Yet we continue to choose, to move forward, to act despite the absence of perfect rational justification. Perhaps there is wisdom in recognizing that not all decisions require complete rational certainty. Sometimes we must choose not because one option is clearly superior, but simply because choosing itself is preferable to remaining paralyzed. The donkey's dilemma reminds us that action often requires a leap beyond pure logic, a willingness to embrace uncertainty and move forward into an unknown future. In the gentle space between the two piles of hay, we find a metaphor for the countless moments in life when we must choose without complete information, when we must act despite uncertainty. There is something oddly comforting about accepting that perfect rational choice is often impossible, that wisdom sometimes lies in the simple act of moving forward. Our journey through philosophical paradoxes now brings us to a puzzle that touches the very nature of existence itself. The paradox of non-being, explored by philosophers from Parmenides to the present day, asks a deceptively simple question. Can we meaningfully speak about things that do not exist? When we say unicorns do not exist, we seem to be making a meaningful statement about unicorns. But how can we refer to something that has no existence? If unicorns truly do not exist, then what are we talking about when we mention them? The statement appears to require unicorns to exist in some sense, in order for us to meaningfully assert their non-existence. This paradox extends into the realm of fictional characters, mythological beings, and hypothetical entities. When we discuss Hamlet's melancholy or Zeus's thunderbolts, we seem to be making meaningful statements about beings that exist only in stories and imagination. Yet these discussions feel substantial and significant, not empty or meaningless. The puzzle deepens when we consider the nature of absence itself. Is the absence of something itself a kind of presence? When we notice the empty chair where a friend usually sits, the silence where music usually plays, or the gap where a tooth once was, these absences seem to have a peculiar reality of their own. Perhaps the paradox of non-being reveals something profound about the nature of meaning and reference. Maybe our language and thought are rich enough to encompass not only what exists but also what does not exist, not only presence but also absence. In the space between being and non-being, we find room for imagination, possibility, and the entire realm of human creativity. There is something deeply soothing about accepting that meaning extends beyond mere physical existence, that our minds can meaningfully engage with possibilities, dreams, and the entire spectrum of what could be as well as what is. The paradox reminds us that reality is not limited to what we can touch and see, but extends into the vast realm of what we can think and imagine. As we continue our gentle exploration, we encounter a paradox that emerges from the realm of knowledge and belief. The paradox of analysis presents a curious problem about the nature of philosophical and scientific discovery. When we analyze a concept to gain deeper understanding, we seem to face an impossible choice. If our analysis merely reveals what we already knew, then it appears to be trivial and uninformative. We have learned nothing new. But if our analysis reveals something genuinely new and surprising, then it seems we could not have been analyzing the original concept at all, since the result is so different from what we started with. Consider the mathematical statement that 2 plus 2 equals 4. If this equation merely restates what we already understand about the numbers 2 and 4, then it tells us nothing new. But if it reveals a genuine mathematical truth that we did not previously grasp, then it seems we could not have fully understood the concepts of 2, plus, and 4 in the first place. The paradox suggests that meaningful analysis is impossible. Either we learn nothing new, making the analysis pointless, or we learn something genuinely new, making it unclear how the analysis relates to our original concepts. Yet we know that analysis does seem to deepen our understanding, that careful examination of ideas often reveals unexpected insights and connections. Perhaps the paradox of analysis points to the mysterious nature of understanding itself. Maybe knowledge is not a collection of fixed facts, but a dynamic process of exploration and discovery. Our concepts may be rich enough to contain depths that we do not initially recognize, truths that become visible only through patient examination. In the gentle space between the familiar and the new, between what we know and what we discover, we find the ongoing adventure of learning. The paradox reminds us that understanding is not a destination but a journey, not a possession but a process of continuous exploration. Our philosophical wandering now brings us to a paradox that touches the nature of infinity itself. Hilbert's Hotel, named after the mathematician David Hilbert, presents us with an imaginary hotel, with infinitely many rooms, numbered 1, 2, 3, and so on without end. Despite being completely full, with one guest in each room, this remarkable hotel can always accommodate new arrivals. When a new guest arrives, the manager simply asks each current guest to move from their room to the room with the next highest number. The guest in room 1 moves to room 2, the guest in room 2 moves to room 3, and so on infinitely. This frees up room 1 for the new arrival, and everyone has a place to stay. The paradox deepens when infinitely many new guests arrive at once. The manager handles this by asking each current guest to move to the room numbered twice their current room number. The guest in room 1 moves to room 2, the guest in room 2 moves to room 4, the guest in room 3 moves to room 6, and so on. This frees up all the odd-numbered rooms for the infinitely many new arrivals. Hilbert's Hotel reveals the counterintuitive nature of infinity. In the realm of the infinite, a completely full hotel can still have room for more guests, even infinitely many more guests. Addition and multiplication behave in unexpected ways when infinite quantities are involved. The paradox invites us to contemplate the mysterious nature of the infinite, a concept that stretches beyond our everyday experience yet appears in mathematics, cosmology, and philosophy. There is something both humbling and beautiful about recognizing that reality may contain aspects that transcend our finite understanding. In the endless corridors of Hilbert's Hotel, we find a metaphor for the inexhaustible nature of knowledge, creativity, and possibility. No matter how much we learn or discover, there always seems to be room for more. The infinite remains forever beyond our complete grasp, yet continues to inspire our exploration and wonder. These paradoxes we have encountered tonight are not merely intellectual puzzles, but windows into the deeper mysteries of existence. They reveal the beautiful complexity that lies beneath the surface of our everyday experience, the places where logic meets wonder, where certainty encounters mystery. As our journey through philosophical paradoxes continues to unfold, we discover that these contradictions are not obstacles to understanding, but invitations to a deeper kind of awareness. They teach us that reality is far richer and more nuanced than our initial assumptions might suggest, that wisdom often lies not in resolving contradictions, but in learning to dwell peacefully within them. Our next philosophical companion emerges from the curious realm of time and causation, a paradox that has puzzled thinkers since ancient days. The grandfather paradox invites us to consider the strange loops that might emerge if time travel were possible. Imagine for a moment that you could journey backward through time and encounter your own grandfather as a young man, before he had met your grandmother. The paradox unfolds like a gentle riddle wrapped in temporal mystery. If you were to prevent your grandfather from meeting your grandmother, then your parent would never be born, and consequently neither would you. But if you were never born, how could you have travelled back in time to create this interference in the first place? The contradiction spirals through time like autumn leaves caught in a circular wind. This temporal puzzle reveals something profound about the nature of causation and possibility. We live in a world where effects follow causes in orderly succession, where the past seems fixed and immutable, while the future remains open to influence. Yet the grandfather paradox suggests that this simple understanding of time might be far more complex than our everyday experience suggests. Perhaps time itself is not the linear river we imagine, flowing steadily from past to future, but something more mysterious and interconnected. Maybe causation operates in ways that transcend our intuitive understanding, creating loops and cycles that challenge our basic assumptions about cause and effect. There is something beautifully humbling about contemplating the nature of time, about recognizing that this most fundamental aspect of our experience remains deeply mysterious. The paradox invites us to rest in uncertainty about the very fabric of temporal reality, to find peace in the recognition that time itself might be far stranger than we imagine. As we drift deeper into our exploration of philosophical mysteries, we encounter a paradox that touches the very nature of knowledge and certainty. The problem of the criterion presents us with a fundamental question about how we can ever truly know anything at all. To have knowledge, it seems we need criteria for distinguishing truth from falsehood, reliable methods for separating genuine knowledge from mere opinion or error. But how do we establish these criteria? It appears we would need to already possess knowledge in order to evaluate which criteria are reliable. We seem caught in a circle where knowledge requires criteria, but criteria require knowledge. We cannot step outside this circle to establish an independent foundation for either. The ancient skeptics used this paradox to suggest that genuine knowledge might be impossible, that we are forever trapped in uncertainty about even our most basic beliefs. Yet somehow we navigate the world successfully, make discoveries, solve problems, and build understanding. The paradox creates a gap between the theoretical impossibility of knowledge and the practical reality of our cognitive achievements. Perhaps the problem of the criterion points to something beautiful about the nature of human understanding. Maybe knowledge is not built on perfectly secure foundations, but emerges from the dynamic interplay between our experiences, our reasoning, and our ongoing engagement with the world. Maybe certainty is less important than the willingness to remain open to new evidence and perspectives. In the gentle space between absolute certainty and complete skepticism, we find room for the kind of humble confidence that characterizes genuine wisdom. The paradox reminds us that knowledge might be more like a web than a tower, more like a conversation than a monument, more like a journey than a destination. Our philosophical wandering now brings us to a paradox that emerges from the intersection of language and reality. The paradox of naming explores the mysterious relationship between words and the world they purport to describe. Consider the simple act of giving a name to something previously unnamed. Before the naming, the thing exists but remains linguistically inaccessible. After the naming, it becomes part of our shared vocabulary and conceptual framework. The paradox asks whether names discover or create the categories they represent. When we name a previously unnamed species of flower, are we discovering a natural category that already existed, or are we creating a new conceptual division in the continuous fabric of reality? The question becomes more complex when we consider abstract concepts like justice, beauty, or consciousness. Some names seem to carve nature at its joints, identifying real distinctions that exist independently of human language. Others appear to impose artificial boundaries on what is actually continuous and interconnected. Yet in our daily lives, we rely heavily on these linguistic categories to navigate and understand our experience. The paradox reveals the profound creative power of language, its ability to shape not just how we communicate, but how we think and perceive. Perhaps names are neither pure discoveries nor pure inventions, but something more mysterious, a collaborative dance between mind and world, between the structures of reality and the structures of understanding. There is something deeply poetic about recognizing that language is not just a tool for describing a pre-existing world, but an active participant in the ongoing creation of meaning. The paradox of naming reminds us that words and world are more intimately connected than we might initially suppose. As our journey continues through the landscape of philosophical puzzles, we encounter the ancient paradox of the stone, a puzzle that emerges from questions about the nature of omnipotence. The paradox asks whether an all-powerful being could create a stone so heavy that even they could not lift it. If they can create such a stone, then there is something they cannot do, namely lift the stone. If they cannot create such a stone, then again there is something they cannot do. This simple question creates a logical trap that seems to show that omnipotence, unlimited power, is actually a self-contradictory concept. Either way we answer the question, we seem to identify a limitation on power that was supposed to be unlimited. The paradox has troubled theologians and philosophers for centuries, raising questions about the coherence of traditional concepts of divine power. Yet perhaps the paradox reveals something important about the nature of logical possibility itself. Maybe some tasks are not just difficult, but actually meaningless, not because of limitations in power, but because of the logical structure of reality. Creating a stone too heavy for an omnipotent being to lift might be like creating a square circle or a married bachelor, a combination of words that fails to describe any possible state of affairs. The paradox of the stone invites us to consider the relationship between power and logic, between what we can imagine and what is actually possible. There is something beautifully mysterious about the limits that logic places on possibility, the way that reason itself constrains what can coherently be conceived. In contemplating this ancient puzzle, we find ourselves at the intersection of power and possibility, exploring the subtle boundaries between what can be imagined and what can actually exist. The paradox reminds us that even unlimited power must operate within the framework of logical cohere touches, the nature of moral responsibility and free choice. Our philosophical exploration now brings us to a paradox that, the paradox of moral luck, explores the puzzling relationship between factors beyond our control and our moral accountability for actions and their consequences. Consider two equally reckless drivers speeding through a residential neighborhood. One encounters no pedestrians and arrives safely at their destination. The other strikes and kills a child who unexpectedly runs into the street. Both drivers made the same choice to drive recklessly, yet we typically hold the second driver more morally responsible because of the tragic outcome. The difference in their moral culpability seems to depend entirely on factors beyond their control, on the presence or absence of a child in the street at that particular moment. The paradox extends beyond dramatic cases to the fabric of our everyday moral lives. Our actions unfold in a world of uncertainty, where consequences depend on countless factors we cannot foresee or control. The family we are born into, the society we grow up in, the genetic predispositions we inherit, the opportunities we encounter, all seem to shape our moral choices in ways that are largely beyond our control. Yet moral responsibility seems to require that we are the true authors of our actions, that we deserve praise or blame for what we freely choose to do. The paradox of moral luck suggests that this kind of ultimate responsibility might be impossible in a world where so much lies beyond our control. Perhaps the paradox points to a more nuanced understanding of moral responsibility, one that acknowledges the complex interplay between choice and circumstance, between agency and luck. Maybe wisdom lies not in perfect moral judgment, but in the humble recognition of our shared vulnerability to forces beyond our control. There is something deeply compassionate about recognizing that moral luck affects us all, that none of us is entirely self-made, that our successes and failures are shaped by countless factors we neither chose nor control. The paradox invites us to approach moral judgment with greater humility and understanding. As we continue our gentle journey through philosophical mysteries, we encounter the paradox of tolerance, a puzzle that emerges from the intersection of freedom and society. This modern paradox asks whether a truly tolerant society should tolerate intolerance. If we allow intolerant movements to flourish in the name of tolerance, they may eventually destroy the very tolerance that permitted their existence. The paradox creates a dilemma for liberal democratic societies that value both freedom of expression and the protection of vulnerable groups. Should tolerance be extended to those who would eliminate tolerance itself? The question becomes particularly acute when considering hate speech, extremist movements, and ideologies that explicitly reject the principles of pluralistic democracy. If we restrict intolerant speech and movements, we seem to violate our commitment to tolerance and free expression. But if we allow them to operate freely, we risk enabling them to undermine the tolerant society that protects everyone's rights. The paradox suggests that unlimited tolerance might be self-defeating, that some limits on tolerance might be necessary to preserve tolerance itself. Perhaps the paradox of tolerance points to the complex nature of social values, the way that different principles can come into tension with each other in practical situations. Maybe wisdom lies not in rigid adherence to any single principle, but in the careful balancing of competing values, in the recognition that tolerance itself requires judgment about what should and should not be tolerated. The paradox reminds us that creating and maintaining a just society is an ongoing challenge that requires continuous reflection and adjustment. There are no simple formulas for navigating the tensions between freedom and security, between individual rights and collective well-being. In the gentle space between absolute tolerance and absolute restriction, we find the ongoing work of democratic deliberation, the patient process of working together to create societies that protect both freedom and dignity for all their members. These paradoxes we have encountered tonight continue to reveal the beautiful complexity that lies beneath the surface of our everyday experience. They show us that the most fundamental aspects of reality, knowledge, morality, and society are far more mysterious and nuanced than our initial assumptions might suggest. As we prepare to explore even more fascinating contradictions, remember that these philosophical puzzles are not problems demanding urgent solutions, but companions for contemplation. They offer us permission to rest in uncertainty, to find peace in questions that resist easy answers, and to discover that sometimes the most profound insights emerge not from resolution, but from the gentle embrace of mystery. Let these ideas settle softly in your mind as we continue our journey deeper into the realm of philosophical paradoxes, where wonder and contradiction dance together in the twilight between waking thought and restful sleep. Our next philosophical companion emerges from the mysterious realm of identity and substitution, a puzzle that reveals how language can play tricks on our understanding of truth. The paradox of substitution presents itself through seemingly innocent examples that spiral into logical confusion. Consider the statement that someone believes Superman can fly. We also know that Superman is Clark Kent, they are the same person. Logic suggests that if Superman can fly and Superman is Clark Kent, then Clark Kent can fly. Yet this substitution creates an odd situation. The person making the original statement might strongly deny that Clark Kent can fly, insisting they know nothing about any flying abilities that a mild-mannered reporter might possess. How can someone believe that Superman can fly while simultaneously believing that Clark Kent cannot when they are the same individual? The paradox reveals the complex relationship between meaning and reference in our language. When we use different names or descriptions for the same thing, We're not just pointing to objects in the world, but evoking different ways of thinking about those objects. Superman and Clark Kent refer to the same person, yet they carry different associations, different contexts of understanding. This puzzle extends far beyond fictional characters into our everyday use of language. We might say that the morning star is beautiful while denying that the evening star is beautiful, not realizing they are both Venus viewed at different times. We might believe that water quenches thirst while being skeptical about whether H2O has the same property, even though they refer to the identical substance. The paradox of substitution invites us to consider how our beliefs are not just about objects in the world, but about the ways we conceive of those objects. Perhaps meaning is richer and more layered than simple reference. Perhaps understanding involves not just knowing what we are talking about, but how we are talking about it. There is something beautifully mysterious about the way language shapes thought, the way different words for the same thing can evoke entirely different mental landscapes. The paradox reminds us that communication is not just about transferring information, but about sharing ways of seeing and understanding. As we drift further into our philosophical exploration, we encounter a paradox that touches the very nature of causation and explanation. The paradox of explanation asks how we can ever truly explain anything at all. When we offer an explanation for some phenomenon, we typically do so by showing how it follows from other, more fundamental facts or principles. But this raises the question of how we explain those more fundamental facts. If we explain A by appealing to B, we might then need to explain B by appealing to C, and C by appealing to D, and so on in an endless chain of explanations. Either this chain continues infinitely, which seems to provide no ultimate explanation at all, or it eventually circles back on itself, which appears to be circular reasoning, or it terminates in some unexplained first principle. Each option seems problematic. An infinite chain of explanations never reaches a satisfying endpoint. Circular explanations appear to explain nothing, and unexplained first principles seem arbitrary, undermining the entire explanatory project. Yet somehow we do seem to understand things, to make sense of phenomena, to provide satisfying explanations that deepen our comprehension of the world. Perhaps the paradox of explanation points to something important about the nature of understanding itself. Maybe explanation is not about finding ultimate foundations, but about creating webs of interconnected meaning. Perhaps understanding emerges not from final answers, but from the ongoing process of making connections, seeing patterns, and integrating experiences. The paradox invites us to embrace a more humble approach to explanation, one that recognizes that our understanding is always partial, always embedded in larger contexts that themselves require further exploration. There is something peaceful about accepting that explanation is an ongoing journey, rather than a destination, a process of continuous discovery rather than a final achievement. In the gentle space between complete explanation and complete mystery, we find room for wonder, curiosity, and the ongoing adventure of learning. The paradox reminds us that the most profound understanding might come not from having all the answers, but from asking ever deeper and more thoughtful questions. Our philosophical wandering now brings us to a paradox that emerges from the realm of decision-making and rational choice. The paradox of the ravens presents us with a puzzle about how evidence supports or undermines our beliefs. Suppose we want to test the hypothesis that all ravens are black. One way to gather evidence would be to observe ravens and note their colour. The paradox begins with the logical observation that the statement, "all ravens are black," is equivalent to "all non-black things are non-ravens." These statements have exactly the same logical content. They are simply different ways of expressing the same relationship between ravens and blackness. If this equivalence is correct, then evidence that supports one statement should equally support the other. Now, observing a white shoe provides evidence for the statement, "all non-black things are non-ravens," since the white shoe is indeed a non-black thing that is also a non-raven. By logical equivalence, this observation should therefore provide evidence that all ravens are black. Yet it seems absurd to suggest that examining white shoes in our closet provides evidence about the colour of ravens. The paradox reveals something puzzling about the nature of evidence and confirmation. It suggests that our intuitive understanding of what counts as relevant evidence might conflict with formal logical principles. Perhaps the relationship between evidence and hypothesis is more complex and context-dependent than simple logical analysis might suggest. There is something deeply intriguing about the way this paradox challenges our assumptions about rationality and scientific method. It invites us to consider whether formal logic always captures the subtleties of human reasoning, whether there might be forms of rational thinking that transcend strict logical rules. The paradox of the ravens reminds us that even our most careful attempts to systematize reasoning can lead to unexpected puzzles and contradictions. Perhaps wisdom lies not in rigid adherence to formal systems, but in the flexible integration of logic, experience, and judgment. As we continue our gentle journey through philosophical mysteries, we encounter a paradox that touches the nature of knowledge and skepticism. The paradox of the lottery presents us with a puzzle about what we can reasonably claim to know. Consider a fair lottery with millions of tickets, only one of which will win. For any particular ticket, it seems reasonable to believe that it will not win, given the astronomically low probability of victory. If it is reasonable to believe of each individual ticket that it will not win, then it seems reasonable to believe that no ticket will win. Yet we know that exactly one ticket must win. That is how lotteries work. The paradox suggests that individually reasonable beliefs can lead to collectively unreasonable conclusions. This puzzle extends beyond gambling into many areas of life where we make judgments under uncertainty. We might reasonably believe that each individual risky activity we engage in will not result in harm, yet collectively these beliefs might lead us to underestimate our overall risk. We might reasonably believe that each of our individual beliefs is true, yet acknowledge that some of them must be false. The paradox of the lottery reveals something important about the relationship between individual and collective rationality. Perhaps what counts as reasonable belief depends not just on the evidence for each individual claim, but on how those claims fit together into a coherent worldview. The paradox invites us to consider the complex dynamics of belief, probability, and knowledge. Maybe rationality requires not just evaluating each belief in isolation, but considering how our beliefs interact and support each other within larger systems of understanding. There is something beautifully humbling about recognizing that even careful probabilistic reasoning can lead to puzzling contradictions. The paradox reminds us that navigating uncertainty is an ongoing challenge that requires not just logical precision, but practical wisdom and good judgment. Our exploration now brings us to a paradox that emerges from the intersection of ethics and logic. The paradox of the Good Samaritan challenges our understanding of moral reasoning and the logic of obligation. The puzzle begins with the observation that moral obligations seem to follow certain logical principles. If we ought to do something, it seems reasonable that we ought to be able to do it. Obligation implies possibility. Consider the statement Jones ought to help the accident victim. This seems to imply that Jones can help the accident victim. But now consider what happens if we make this implication explicit. Jones ought to help the accident victim and Jones can help the accident victim. The second part of this conjunction seems to imply that there is an accident victim who needs help. The paradox suggests that moral obligations might logically imply the existence of the very problems they aim to address. If we ought to help those in need, this seems to imply that there are people in need. If we ought to prevent suffering, this seems to imply that there is suffering to prevent. The logic of moral obligation appears to require the existence of moral problems. This creates a troubling situation where moral reasoning seems to depend on the persistence of moral problems. The very possibility of virtue appears to require the existence of vice. The opportunity for compassion seems to demand the presence of suffering. The chance for heroism appears to need the reality of danger. The paradox of the Good Samaritan invites us to consider the complex relationship between morality and the world in which moral action takes place. Perhaps the puzzle points to something profound about the nature of ethics, the way that moral values are not abstract principles but lived responses to the concrete situations we encounter. Maybe wisdom lies in recognizing that morality is not about creating a perfect world where moral choice becomes unnecessary, but about responding with compassion and integrity to the imperfect world in which we actually live. The paradox reminds us that virtue is not an abstract achievement, but a practical commitment to doing good in a world where good needs to be done. As our gentle journey through philosophical paradoxes continues, we encounter a puzzle that touches the nature of time and existence. The paradox of temporal parts asks whether objects persist through time by existing entirely at each moment or by having different parts at different times. Consider yourself as you were 10 years ago and as you are today. Are you the same person who has endured through time, Or are you a series of different temporal stages connected by memory and continuity? If objects exist entirely at each moment, then the same thing exists at different times, which seems to create problems about change. How can something be both tall and short, both young and old, both here and there? If objects have different temporal parts at different times, then nothing really persists. There are only different stages that we mistakenly think of as the same, continuing thing. The paradox reveals something puzzling about the relationship between identity and time. We experience ourselves as continuing beings who persist through change, yet change seems to require that we become different from what we were. The puzzle asks whether persistence and change are ultimately compatible, or whether one must be sacrificed for the other. Perhaps the paradox of temporal parts points to the mysterious nature of time itself, the way that temporal experience resists simple conceptual analysis. Maybe the relationship between identity and change is more subtle and complex than our everyday thinking suggests, more like a gentle flow than a series of discrete snapshots. There is something deeply soothing about accepting that temporal existence is inherently mysterious, that the nature of persistence through time transcends our ability to capture it completely in concepts and categories. The paradox invites us to rest in the wonder of temporal existence, to find peace in the mystery of how we can be both the same and different across the flowing moments of our lives. In contemplating these paradoxes of time and identity, we find ourselves at the heart of what it means to exist as temporal beings, creatures who live in the flow of moments while somehow maintaining continuity across change. The mystery is not a problem to be solved, but a wonder to be appreciated, a reminder that existence itself is far richer and more complex than our theories can fully capture. These philosophical paradoxes we have encountered tonight continue to reveal the beautiful complexity that lies beneath the surface of our everyday experience. They show us that reality is not as straightforward as it might initially appear, that the most basic concepts we use to navigate the world contain depths and mysteries that have puzzled the finest minds for centuries. As we prepare to explore even more fascinating contradictions, remember that these puzzles are not obstacles to understanding, but doorways to deeper appreciation of the mystery and wonder that surrounds us. They invite us to embrace uncertainty not as a failure of knowledge, but as an opportunity for continued exploration and discovery. Let these ideas settle gently in your consciousness as we continue our journey through the twilight realm where philosophy meets sleep, where profound questions become gentle companions for the journey into rest. The landscape of paradox stretches endlessly before us, filled with wonders that sparkle like stars in the darkness of the unknown. Our philosophical wandering now brings us to a paradox that emerges from the nature of time and experience itself. The paradox of the specious present asks us to consider the curious nature of the present moment. When we experience the present, it seems to have duration, to last for a brief but measurable span of time. We hear a melody unfold, watch a bird fly across our field of vision, feel a gentle breeze pass over our skin. These experiences feel immediate and present, yet they clearly unfold over time. The puzzle begins when we try to locate this experienced present within the flow of objective time. If the present moment is truly instantaneous, lasting zero duration, then how can we experience events that unfold over time as present? A melody requires multiple notes played in sequence, yet we experience it as a unified present phenomenon, not as a series of disconnected past moments. But if the present has duration, then parts of what we call present must actually be past or future. The beginning of the melody we are currently hearing must be in the past by the time we reach its end, yet we experience the whole melody as present. The paradox suggests that our lived experience of time cannot be mapped neatly onto the physicist's conception of temporal flow. Perhaps the specious present reveals something profound about the nature of consciousness and temporality. Maybe our awareness does not exist at mathematical points in time, but rather spans brief intervals, weaving past, present, and future into the seamless fabric of experience. Our consciousness might be inherently temporal, existing not in moments, but across moments. There is something deeply mysterious about this temporal thickness of experience, this way that consciousness seems to gather time into itself. The paradox invites us to consider whether subjective time and objective time might be fundamentally different kinds of phenomena, operating by different principles and revealing different aspects of reality. In the gentle flow between instant and duration, between the mathematical point of now and the lived experience of nowness, we find a reminder that consciousness itself is one of the deepest mysteries we encounter. The present moment, which seems so immediate and obvious, dissolves into paradox the moment we examine it carefully. As we drift further into our exploration of philosophical mysteries, we encounter a paradox that touches the very foundations of mathematics and logic. The Russell paradox emerges from what initially seems like a simple question about sets and membership. Consider the set of all sets that do not contain themselves as members. Most sets fall into this category. The set of all books does not itself contain books. The set of all read things is not itself read. But now we must ask whether this set of non-self-containing sets contains itself as a member. If it does contain itself, then it belongs to the category of sets that contain themselves, which means it should not be included in the set of non-self-containing sets. But if it does not contain itself, then it belongs to the category of non-self-containing sets, which means it should be included in that very set. The paradox creates a logical contradiction that cannot be resolved through simple reasoning. It reveals that our intuitive notion of sets and membership, concepts that seem perfectly clear and unproblematic, can lead to impossible situations when pushed to their logical limits. The discovery of this paradox at the beginning of the 20th century sent shockwaves through the mathematical community. Russell's paradox points to something profound about the relationship between language, logic, and reality. Perhaps our conceptual systems, no matter how careful and systematic, will always contain the seeds of their own contradiction. Maybe the price of the richness and flexibility that makes language and thought so powerful is the occasional emergence of paradox and inconsistency. The paradox invites us to embrace intellectual humility, to recognize that even our most careful reasoning can lead us into logical tangles. There is something beautifully mysterious about the way that precision itself can generate imprecision, the way that the attempt to capture reality completely in concepts can reveal the limits of conceptual capture. In contemplating Russell's paradox, we find ourselves at the intersection of logic and mystery, where the most rigorous thinking encounters its own boundaries. The paradox reminds us that reality may always exceed our attempts to systematize it completely, that there will always be aspects of existence that slip through the nets of our most careful analysis. Our journey through philosophical paradoxes now brings us to a puzzle that emerges from the realm of identity and indiscernibility. The paradox of the identical twins asks us to consider what makes two things genuinely distinct from one another. Imagine twins who are identical in every possible way, sharing not just the same DNA but occupying the same space, having the same thoughts, the same memories, the same physical properties down to the quantum level. According to the principle of the identity of indiscernibles, if two things are identical in all their properties, then they are not actually two things but one thing described in two different ways. Yet our initial description assumes that there are two twins, two distinct entities. The paradox asks whether genuine duplication is actually possible, or whether perfect similarity necessarily collapses into identity. The puzzle deepens when we consider that spatial location itself is often considered a property. If the twins occupy the same space, then they share even this most basic distinguishing characteristic. What could possibly make them two rather than one? Perhaps distinctness requires some form of difference, no matter how subtle or fundamental. Yet our language and thought seem to allow for the possibility of perfect duplicates, identical copies that remain numerically distinct despite their qualitative similarity. Science fiction is filled with stories of perfect duplicates, teleportation devices that create exact copies, and parallel universes containing identical individuals. The paradox of the identical twins invites us to consider the relationship between qualitative and numerical identity, between being the same kind of thing and being the same individual thing. Maybe distinctness is not just about properties, but about something more fundamental and mysterious, something that transcends description and analysis. There is something deeply intriguing about the possibility that identity itself might be irreducible, that what makes something the particular thing it is cannot be captured entirely in terms of its properties and characteristics. The paradox points to a mystery at the heart of existence, the question of what makes each thing uniquely itself. As we continue our gentle exploration, we encounter a paradox that emerges from the intersection of knowledge and possibility. The paradox of omniscience asks whether it is possible for any being to know everything there is to know. The question begins simply enough, but quickly leads to puzzling complications about the nature of knowledge and truth. Consider whether an omniscient being could know what it is like to be ignorant, what it feels like not to know something. Knowledge of ignorance seems to require the experience of not knowing, but an omniscient being never lacks knowledge. Can one truly understand forgetfulness without forgetting, or confusion without being confused? The paradox deepens when we consider knowledge of future contingent events. If an omniscient being knows that you will choose chocolate ice cream tomorrow, does this knowledge make your choice inevitable? Can genuine knowledge of the future coexist with genuine freedom of choice? Either the future is determined, making freedom an illusion, or the future is open, making certain knowledge impossible. Perhaps the paradox of omniscience reveals something important about the relationship between knowledge and experience, between understanding and participation. Maybe some forms of knowledge require limitations. Some types of understanding emerge only through the experience of not understanding. The paradox invites us to consider whether complete knowledge might be not just practically impossible, but conceptually incoherent. Perhaps the very nature of knowledge requires boundaries, blind spots, and areas of uncertainty. Maybe wisdom lies not in knowing everything, but in understanding the proper relationship between knowledge and mystery. There is something beautifully humbling about recognizing that even omniscience, the ultimate form of knowledge, generates paradox and contradiction. The puzzle reminds us that knowledge itself is more mysterious and complex than we might initially suppose, that even perfect understanding might contain its own forms of incompleteness. Our philosophical wandering now brings us to a paradox that touches the nature of existence and possibility. The paradox of contingent existence asks why anything exists at all, rather than nothing. This question, sometimes called the deepest question in philosophy, seems to demand an explanation for the very fact of existence itself. Yet any explanation we might offer seems to presuppose the existence of something that can serve as the explainer. If we explain the existence of the universe by appealing to God, we must then explain God's existence. If we explain existence by appealing to natural laws, we must explain why those laws exist rather than others, or rather than no laws at all. The paradox suggests that the question of existence might be unanswerable, not because we lack sufficient knowledge, but because the very nature of explanation requires the prior existence of something that can do the explaining. We seem caught in a circle where existence can only be explained in terms of other existence, never in terms of pure non-existence. Perhaps the paradox of contingent existence points to something profound about the relationship between being and explanation. Maybe existence is not the kind of thing that can be explained in the way we explain other phenomena. Perhaps being is more fundamental than explanation, more basic than the categories of thought we use to make sense of particular things within the world. The paradox invites us to approach the mystery of existence with wonder rather than frustration, to find peace in the recognition that some questions may transcend the bounds of possible answers. There is something deeply moving about contemplating the sheer improbability and mystery of our own existence, the fact that anything exists at all in the vast darkness of possibility. In the gentle space between being and nothingness, between the fact of existence and the mystery of why there is anything rather than nothing, we find an invitation to gratitude and awe. The paradox reminds us that existence itself is not something to be taken for granted, but something to be celebrated as the most fundamental and inexplicable gift. As we drift deeper into our philosophical exploration, we encounter a paradox that emerges from the realm of ethics and moral reasoning. The paradox of supererogation asks whether it is possible to do more than duty requires, to act in ways that go beyond moral obligation into the realm of moral heroism or saintliness. If an action is truly good, the reasoning goes, then surely we ought to perform it. But if we ought to perform it, then it is not supererogatory, but simply required. The paradox suggests that there can be no genuine category of actions that are good but not required, praiseworthy but not obligatory. Yet our moral experience seems filled with examples of supererogatory action. The soldier who throws himself on a grenade to save his comrades, the philanthropist who gives away her fortune to help the poor, the teacher who dedicates her life to educating underprivileged children, all seem to be doing more than duty strictly requires. The paradox reveals a tension between different ways of thinking about moral value. Perhaps goodness comes in degrees, with some actions being minimally acceptable, others being admirable, and still others being truly heroic. Maybe the category of moral obligation captures only a subset of moral value, the minimum threshold of decent behaviour, rather than the full spectrum of possible goodness. The paradox of supererogation invites us to consider the relationship between duty and aspiration, between what morality demands and what morality inspires. Perhaps the richest moral life involves not just meeting obligations, but responding to ideals, not just avoiding wrong, but actively pursuing the good. There is something beautifully inspiring about recognizing that morality extends beyond duty into the realm of gift and grace, that there are forms of goodness that emerge not from obligation, but from love, compassion, and the generous response to human need. The paradox reminds us that ethics is not just about rules and requirements, but about the full flowering of human moral potential. Our journey through philosophical paradoxes now brings us to a puzzle that emerges from the nature of personal identity and moral responsibility. The paradox of moral responsibility through time asks whether we can be held accountable for actions performed by earlier versions of ourselves. If personal identity changes over time, as many philosophers suggest, then the person who committed some past action may no longer exist in any meaningful sense. Consider someone who committed a crime decades ago but has since undergone profound transformation. They have different beliefs, different values, different patterns of thought and behaviour. Their body has been completely renewed at the cellular level. Their brain has been rewired through experience and reflection. In what sense are they the same person who committed the original crime? The paradox deepens when we consider that moral responsibility seems to require personal identity over time. We hold people accountable for their past actions precisely because we assume they are the same individuals who performed those actions. But if identity is more fluid and changeable than we typically assume, then moral responsibility becomes problematic. Yet something in us rebels against the suggestion that people can escape moral accountability simply by changing over time. The victim of a decades-old crime deserves justice. Society needs systems of accountability, and individuals must take responsibility for their life choices and their consequences. Perhaps the paradox of moral responsibility through time points to the complex relationship between continuity and change in human existence. Maybe personal identity is neither completely stable nor completely fluid, but something more subtle, a pattern of continuity within change that preserves accountability while allowing for growth and transformation. The paradox invites us to consider how responsibility and forgiveness, accountability and redemption can coexist in our moral thinking. There is something deeply important about holding people accountable for their actions while also recognizing their capacity for genuine change and moral growth. In the gentle space between continuity and transformation, between accountability and forgiveness, we find the ongoing challenge of creating just and compassionate responses to human moral failure. The paradox reminds us that moral thinking must be nuanced enough to honour both justice and mercy, both responsibility and redemption. As our philosophical exploration continues, we encounter a paradox that touches the very nature of consciousness and experience. The paradox of phenomenal concepts asks how we can have concepts of our own conscious experiences. When I think about the redness of red or the painfulness of pain, I seem to be using concepts that refer to the qualitative aspects of my experience, the what it is likeness of consciousness. But concepts, as they are typically understood, are supposed to be shareable, public and objective. They allow us to communicate about common features of our shared world. The concept of red allows us to coordinate our behaviour around red objects, to teach children about colour, to describe the world in language others can understand. Yet the qualitative aspects of experience seem inherently private and subjective. My experience of red might be systematically different from yours in ways that we could never detect through behaviour or communication. The redness I experience might be what you would call blueness, yet we would never know because our behavioural responses to red objects would be identical. The paradox asks how concepts that are supposed to be public and shareable can refer to experiences that seem inherently private and incommunicable. Perhaps the very idea of phenomenal concepts is incoherent, an attempt to make objective what is essentially subjective. Or perhaps the paradox reveals something important about the relationship between consciousness and language, between inner experience and outer expression. Maybe concepts are richer and more mysterious than we typically assume, capable of bridging the gap between subjective experience and objective communication in ways we do not fully understand. The paradox of phenomenal concepts invites us to consider the deep mystery of consciousness, the way that inner experience both connects us to others through shared concepts and separates us in the privacy of subjective awareness. There is something beautifully mysterious about the fact that we can communicate about experiences that may be fundamentally incommunicable. In contemplating this paradox, we find ourselves at the heart of the mind-body problem, the question of how consciousness relates to the physical world. The puzzle reminds us that consciousness itself remains one of the deepest mysteries we encounter, a phenomenon so intimate and obvious that it seems to resist objective analysis. Our gentle journey through philosophical paradoxes now brings us to a puzzle that emerges from the intersection of language and logic. The paradox of analysis revisits a question we touched upon earlier, but from a different angle, asking how language can be both informative and analytic. When we provide a definition or analysis of a concept, we seem to face an impossible choice between triviality and incoherence. If our analysis merely restates what we already understand, then it provides no new information and seems pointless. But if our analysis reveals something genuinely surprising, then it seems we could not have been analysing the original concept at all, since the result bears little resemblance to what we started with. Consider the analysis that knowledge is justified true belief. If this simply restates what we already meant by knowledge, then it tells us nothing new. But if it reveals something unexpected about the nature of knowledge, then it seems we were not really analysing knowledge but defining some new concept that happens to bear the same name. The paradox reveals something puzzling about the relationship between meaning and discovery in conceptual analysis. Perhaps understanding is not a static possession, but a dynamic process, not a fixed content but an evolving relationship between mind and world. Maybe concepts are rich enough to contain depths that we do not initially recognise, truths that become visible only through patient examination and careful analysis. Perhaps analysis does not simply reveal what was already there, but participates in the ongoing creation of meaning. The paradox of analysis invites us to embrace a more dynamic understanding of language and thought, one that recognises the creative power of careful reflection and systematic inquiry. There is something beautifully mysterious about the way that thinking about thinking can generate genuine insights and unexpected discoveries. In the gentle space between the familiar and the surprising, between what we know and what we discover in knowing, we find the ongoing adventure of philosophical reflection. The paradox reminds us that meaning itself is more complex and creative than we might initially suppose. These paradoxes we have encountered tonight continue to weave their way through the fundamental questions of human existence, revealing the beautiful complexity that lies beneath the surface of our everyday experience. They show us that philosophy is not just an academic discipline, but a form of wonder, not just a collection of theories, but a way of remaining open to mystery. As we prepare to explore even more fascinating contradictions, remember that these puzzles are gentle companions for the journey into sleep, invitations to let go of the need for complete understanding and to rest in the wonder of questions that transcend easy answers. Let these philosophical mysteries settle softly in your consciousness like snowflakes on still water, each one unique and beautiful, each one a reminder that reality is far richer and more mysterious than our concepts can fully capture. The landscape of paradox stretches endlessly before us, filled with wonders that sparkle in the twilight between thought and dream. Our philosophical wandering now brings us to a paradox that emerges from the mysterious realm of causation itself. The paradox of mental causation asks how our thoughts and desires can influence the physical world when everything in that world seems to operate according to strict physical laws. When you decide to raise your hand and your hand rises, what exactly has happened? Your mental intention seems to cause a physical event, yet physics suggests that every physical event has sufficient physical causes. If mental events are truly non-physical, as many philosophers have argued, then how can they interact with physical systems? Non-physical entities should not be able to push atoms around or trigger neural firing. But if mental events are actually physical events in the brain, then it becomes unclear why we experience them as thoughts and feelings rather than simply as neural activity. The paradox deepens when we consider that our sense of agency, our feeling that we are the authors of our actions, seems fundamental to human experience. We plan, we choose, we act, and we take responsibility for the consequences. Yet this entire framework of mental causation appears to conflict with our scientific understanding of the world as a causally closed physical system. Perhaps the paradox of mental causation reveals something profound about the relationship between mind and world, between consciousness and physical reality. Maybe the sharp distinction between mental and physical is itself problematic, a conceptual division that creates artificial problems. Perhaps mind and matter are not separate substances, but different aspects of a more fundamental reality. There is something deeply mysterious about the way consciousness seems to bridge the gap between thought and action, between inner experience and outer behavior. The paradox invites us to wonder at the miracle of agency, the way that intentions somehow translate into movements, that purposes somehow guide behavior through the complex machinery of the body. In contemplating this puzzle, we find ourselves at the intersection of philosophy of mind and philosophy of action, exploring the enigma of how consciousness participates in the causal order of the world. The mystery is not a problem to be solved, but a wonder to be appreciated, a reminder that the relationship between mind and world is far more intricate than our theories can fully capture. As we drift deeper into our exploration of philosophical mysteries, we encounter a paradox that touches the nature of moral judgment itself. The paradox of moral disagreement asks how genuine moral disagreement is possible if moral truths are objective. When two people disagree about whether some action is right or wrong, at least one of them must be mistaken if there are genuine moral facts to be discovered. Yet moral disagreement often persists even among thoughtful, well-informed, and morally sensitive individuals. People who share similar values and reasoning abilities can reach opposite conclusions about complex moral issues. This persistent disagreement seems puzzling if morality is a matter of objective truth rather than subjective preference. The paradox suggests several uncomfortable possibilities. Perhaps there are no objective moral truths, and moral disagreement reflects the fact that we are simply expressing personal preferences or cultural conditioning. Or perhaps moral truths exist but are so difficult to discern that even careful moral reasoning frequently leads us astray. Alternatively, maybe moral disagreement is often not really about fundamental moral principles, but about factual questions, psychological assumptions, or the application of shared values to complex situations. Perhaps apparent moral disagreement sometimes dissolves when we examine more carefully what people are actually disagreeing about. The paradox of moral disagreement invites us to consider the complex relationship between objectivity and disagreement, between truth and consensus. Maybe the persistence of moral disagreement does not undermine moral objectivity, but reflects the genuine difficulty of moral reasoning and the complexity of moral phenomena. There is something beautifully humbling about recognizing that moral truth, if it exists, is not easily accessible to human reason. The paradox reminds us that moral thinking requires not just logical precision, but empathy, imagination, and the willingness to engage seriously with perspectives different from our own, in the gentle space between certainty and doubt, between conviction and openness. We find the ongoing challenge of moral reflection. The paradox invites us to hold our moral beliefs with both confidence and humility, to remain committed to our values while staying open to new insights and perspectives. Our journey through philosophical paradoxes now brings us to a puzzle that emerges from the nature of possibility itself. The paradox of possible worlds asks how we should understand claims about what could have been the case. When we say that things could have been different, that alternative possibilities existed, what exactly are we referring to? One influential approach suggests that possible worlds are concrete realities, alternative universes that exist just as robustly as our own. On this view, when we say that you could have chosen differently, we are saying that there exists some possible world where you did choose differently. But this approach seems to multiply entities beyond necessity, populating reality with countless alternative universes. Yet the alternative approaches face their own difficulties. If possible worlds are abstract objects like numbers or sets, then it becomes unclear how they can ground claims about concrete possibilities. If they are mental constructions or linguistic representations, then possibility seems to become subjective rather than objective. The paradox reveals something puzzling about the relationship between actuality and possibility, between what is the case and what could have been the case. Our language and thought seem to require a robust notion of possibility, yet it remains unclear what possibilities actually are or how they relate to the actual world. Perhaps the paradox of possible worlds points to something fundamental about the structure of reality itself, the way that actuality is surrounded by a penumbra of unrealized possibilities. Maybe possibility is not something that can be reduced to more basic notions, but is itself a fundamental feature of the world. There is something beautifully mysterious about the realm of the possible, the vast landscape of what might have been and what could yet be. The paradox invites us to wonder at the richness of possibility, the way that reality seems to contain not just what is, but also what is not yet but could be. In contemplating this puzzle, we find ourselves at the intersection of metaphysics and modal logic, exploring questions about the fundamental structure of reality and the nature of necessity and possibility. The mystery reminds us that even our most basic concepts about what could be true or false open onto profound philosophical questions. As we continue our gentle exploration, we encounter a paradox that touches the very foundations of rational belief. The paradox of the preface returns to us in a new form, asking not just about the author's dilemma, but about the broader question of how we should proportion our confidence to our evidence when we hold many beliefs simultaneously. Consider that you hold thousands of beliefs about the world around you, from simple perceptual beliefs about your immediate environment to complex theoretical beliefs about history, science, and human nature. For each individual belief you might have good evidence and feel quite confident, yet you also know from experience that some of your beliefs must be false, that human beings are fallible, and that even careful reasoning sometimes leads us astray. This creates a curious situation where you are highly confident in each individual belief, while simultaneously being confident that some of those beliefs are false. The paradox asks how we can maintain this combination of local confidence and global humility without falling into contradiction. Perhaps the paradox points to something important about the nature of rational belief under uncertainty. Maybe perfect coherence in our belief system is not achievable or even desirable. Perhaps wisdom lies in accepting that our beliefs form a complex web where individual confidence and overall fallibility can coexist. The paradox invites us to embrace a form of intellectual humility that recognizes the limits of human knowledge, while still allowing us to act and believe with reasonable confidence. There is something beautifully human about this combination of confidence and doubt, certainty and uncertainty. In the gentle balance between individual conviction and overall humility, we find a model for thoughtful engagement with questions that matter. The paradox reminds us that rational belief is not about achieving perfect certainty, but about navigating uncertainty with wisdom and grace. Our philosophical wandering now brings us to a paradox that emerges from the realm of personal identity and psychological continuity. The paradox of fission asks what happens to personal identity when a person's psychology is somehow divided or duplicated. Imagine that through some futuristic technology, your brain is split, and each half is placed in a different body, with each resulting person having your complete memories and personality. Both resulting individuals would have equal claim to being you, since both would have psychological continuity with your pre-fission self. Yet they would be distinct persons with separate futures. The paradox asks whether you survive as both persons, as neither person, or as one but not the other. Each answer seems to lead to puzzling consequences. If you survive as both persons, then personal identity seems not to be a one-to-one relation, since one person has become two. If you survive as neither, then mere duplication has caused you to cease to exist, even though your psychology continues unchanged in both branches. If you survive as one but not the other, then personal identity seems to depend on arbitrary factors, since both branches have equal claim to being you. The paradox of fission reveals something puzzling about our concept of personal identity, the way that it seems to presuppose a unique continuity that might not always be possible. Perhaps personal identity is not the robust determinate relation we typically assume it to be. Maybe the paradox points to something important about the conventional nature of personal identity, the way that our concepts of selfhood are shaped by the ordinary circumstances of human life, where fission does not occur. Perhaps identity is not discovered but constructed, not found but created through our practices of attribution and recognition. There is something deeply thought-provoking about imagining circumstances where our ordinary concepts break down, where the smooth functioning of everyday categories encounters impossible situations. The paradox invites us to consider how much of what we take for granted about identity depends on the contingent features of our world. In contemplating the puzzle of fission, we find ourselves exploring the boundaries of selfhood, the edges where personal identity meets its limits. The mystery reminds us that even our most intimate concepts, Our understanding of what makes us who we are can dissolve into paradox when pushed to their extremes. As we drift further into our exploration of philosophical mysteries, we encounter a paradox that touches the nature of knowledge and testimony. The paradox of testimonial knowledge asks how we can gain genuine knowledge through the reports of others, when those reports are only as reliable as the knowledge of the person providing them. When someone tells you that it is raining outside, you typically accept this as knowledge if you trust the person and believe they are in a position to know. Yet their knowledge depends on their own observations or on the testimony of others, creating a potentially infinite chain of dependence. At what point does this chain ground itself in genuine first-hand knowledge? The paradox deepens when we consider that most of what we believe about the world comes not from our own direct experience, but from the testimony of others. Our knowledge of history, science, geography, and countless other domains depends fundamentally on trusting the reports and expertise of other people. Yet if testimonial knowledge is genuinely derivative, depending entirely on the first-hand knowledge of others, then it seems that only direct observation and reasoning can provide genuine knowledge. But this would drastically restrict the scope of human knowledge, eliminating most of what we take ourselves to know about the world. Perhaps the paradox of testimonial knowledge reveals something important about the social nature of human knowledge, the way that understanding is not just an individual achievement, but a collective enterprise. Maybe knowledge is not built up from isolated individual observations, but emerges from the complex web of communication and trust that connects us to others. The paradox invites us to consider the role of trust and community in our epistemic lives, the way that knowledge depends not just on evidence and reasoning, but on relationships and social practices. There is something beautifully human about the way that knowing is not a solitary activity but a shared endeavour. In the gentle space between individual observation and collective understanding, we find the social dimension of knowledge that makes learning and discovery possible. The paradox reminds us that we are not isolated knowers but participants in ongoing conversations that span generations and cultures. Our journey through philosophical paradoxes now brings us to a puzzle that emerges from the intersection of ethics and metaphysics. The paradox of future generations asks how we can have moral obligations to people who do not yet exist and may never exist. When we make decisions about environmental protection, resource conservation, or nuclear waste disposal, we typically justify these choices by appealing to their effects on future generations, yet future people do not currently exist, and their existence depends partly on the very decisions we're making now. Different policy choices will lead to different people being born, different individuals composing future generations. The people who will exist if we choose one policy will be different from those who will exist if we choose another. The paradox suggests that we cannot harm future generations through our current choices, since the alternative choices would result in different people existing. The individuals who exist in the future will owe their very existence to our current decisions, including decisions that we might consider harmful to their interests. This creates a puzzling situation where it seems impossible to act against the interests of future generations, since any alternative course of action would result in different generations existing altogether. Yet our moral intuitions strongly suggest that we do have obligations to future people, that our current choices can indeed benefit or harm those who come after us. Perhaps the paradox of future generations reveals something important about the relationship between existence and well-being, between identity and interest. Maybe our obligations are not just to specific future individuals, but to the general project of ensuring that whoever exists in the future will be able to flourish. The paradox invites us to consider how moral thinking can extend across time and generations, how present choices can express care and concern for people we will never meet. There is something beautifully generous about the idea that ethics requires us to consider not just our contemporaries, but those who will inherit the world we create. In contemplating our obligations to future generations, we find ourselves exploring the temporal dimensions of moral responsibility, the way that ethical thinking must span not just space, but time. The mystery reminds us that moral community extends beyond the present moment to include those who are yet to be born. As our gentle exploration continues, we encounter a paradox that touches the nature of rational choice and decision-making. The paradox of Newcomb's problem presents us with a scenario that seems to pit different principles of rational choice against each other in irreconcilable conflict. Imagine that a highly reliable predictor offers you a choice between two boxes. One box is transparent and contains $1,000. The other box is opaque and either contains $1 million or nothing, depending on the predictor's forecast of your choice. If the predictor expects you to take only the opaque box, it contains $1 million. If the predictor expects you to take both boxes, the opaque box is empty. One principle of rational choice suggests that you should take both boxes, since the contents have already been determined, and taking both boxes will always give you at least as much as taking only one. Another principle suggests that you should take only the opaque box, since people who make this choice typically receive $1 million, while those who take both boxes typically receive only 1,000. The paradox creates a situation where different theories of rational choice recommend opposite actions, yet both theories seem compelling in their own right. It reveals something puzzling about the relationship between causation and correlation, between what our actions cause and what they indicate about us. Perhaps Newcomb's problem points to something fundamental about the nature of rational choice under conditions where our decisions are themselves objects of prediction and analysis. Maybe the paradox reveals tensions in our concept of rationality that cannot be easily resolved. The puzzle invites us to consider how rational choice operates in situations where we are dealing not just with an indifferent natural world, but with other agents who are trying to predict and respond to our behaviour. There is something deeply intriguing about scenarios where the very attempt to choose rationally becomes part of the situation we are trying to navigate rationally. In contemplating this paradox, we find ourselves exploring the complex dynamics of strategic interaction, the way that rational choice becomes more complicated when we are choosing in a world populated by other rational choosers. The mystery reminds us that rationality itself is more complex and contextual than we might initially suppose. Our philosophical wandering now brings us to a paradox that emerges from the realm of consciousness and personal experience. The paradox of the inverted spectrum asks whether it is possible for two people to have systematically different colour experiences while behaving identically in all observable ways. Perhaps when you look at a ripe strawberry, and I look at the same strawberry, you have the experience I would call blue, while I have the experience you would call red. Yet we both learn to call strawberries red, and behave identically toward red objects. This possibility seems coherent because the relationship between physical stimuli and conscious experience might vary between individuals in ways that are entirely private and undetectable. Your colour experiences and mine might be systematically inverted, like photographic negatives of each other, yet this difference would never show up in our behaviour or communication. The paradox raises profound questions about the nature of conscious experience and its relationship to the physical world. If inverted spectra are possible, then consciousness contains aspects that are entirely private and incommunicable. But if they are impossible, then conscious experience must be more tightly connected to behaviour and physical processes than we might have thought. Perhaps the paradox of the inverted spectrum reveals something important about the relationship between the subjective and objective dimensions of experience, between what consciousness feels like from the inside and how it appears from the outside. Maybe the very possibility of systematic experiential differences that make no behavioural difference points to something irreducible about conscious experience. The paradox invites us to consider the deep mystery of consciousness, the way that subjective experience seems to have qualities that resist objective analysis. There is something beautifully mysterious about the possibility that each of us might inhabit a slightly different experiential world while sharing a common behavioural and linguistic space. In contemplating the puzzle of inverted spectra, we find ourselves at the heart of the mind-body problem, exploring questions about how conscious experience relates to physical processes and behavioural dispositions. The mystery reminds us that consciousness itself remains one of the deepest puzzles in philosophy and science. As we continue our gentle journey through philosophical mysteries, we encounter a paradox that touches the very nature of truth and meaning. The paradox of the contingent. A priori asks how there can be truths that are knowable, independently of experience, yet might have been false. Consider the statement that the standard meter bar in Paris is 1 meter long. This seems to be true by definition, since the meter was originally defined as the length of this particular bar. Yet the bar might have been a different length if historical circumstances had been different, if it had been manufactured slightly differently, or if it had been subjected to different temperatures during the defining moment. The truth seems both necessary, given how we defined the meter, and contingent since the bar might have had a different length. The paradox reveals something puzzling about the relationship between meaning and truth, between how we define our concepts and what makes our statements true or false. Perhaps the sharp distinction between analytic and synthetic truths, between truths of meaning and truths of fact, is not as clear as philosophers have traditionally assumed. Maybe some truths are knowable or true by our practices of definition and measurement. Perhaps virtue of meaning alone, but because they are made priori, not because they are true in the relationship between language and world, is more complex and dynamic than simple theories of meaning can capture. The paradox of the contingent, a priori, invites us to consider how human practices and conventions participate in the creation of truth, how our ways of measuring and defining help to shape the very reality we're trying to describe. There is something deeply interesting about the way that truth emerges from the interaction between mind and world, between our concepts and the reality they are meant to capture. In contemplating this puzzle, we find ourselves exploring the boundary between convention and discovery, between what we create through our practices and what we find already there in the world. The mystery reminds us that the relationship between truth and knowledge is more intricate than our initial theories might suggest. These philosophical paradoxes we have encountered tonight continue to reveal the beautiful complexity that underlies our everyday experience of thinking, knowing, and existing. They show us that even our most basic concepts about mind, world, truth, and value contain depths and mysteries that resist simple analysis. As we prepare to explore even more fascinating contradictions, remember that these puzzles are not obstacles to understanding, but invitations to deeper wonder. They offer us permission to rest in uncertainty, to find peace in questions that transcend easy resolution, and to discover that sometimes the most profound insights emerge not from answers, but from the patient contemplation of beautiful mysteries. Let these philosophical paradoxes settle gently in your awareness, like stars appearing in the darkening sky, each one a point of light in the vast mystery of existence. The landscape of paradox stretches endlessly around us, filled with wonders that illuminate the deeper patterns of reality, even as they remind us how much remains forever, beyond our complete understanding. Our philosophical wandering now brings us to a paradox that emerges from the mysterious realm of perception and reality itself. The paradox of primary and secondary qualities asks us to consider which aspects of our experience truly belong to the world and which belong only to our minds. When you bite into a fresh apple, you experience its crisp texture, sweet taste, and bright red colour. Yet science suggests that the apple itself possesses only shape, size, and molecular structure. The sweetness, the redness, the crispness exist only in the meeting between apple and perceiver. This creates a curious division in our experience of the world. Primary qualities like extension, motion, and number seem to exist independently of any observer. The apple has a definite shape whether anyone is looking at it or not, but secondary qualities like colour, taste, and smell appear to exist only when there is a conscious being present to experience them. The redness of the apple emerges from the interaction between light waves in your visual system, not from any intrinsic redness in the apple itself. Yet this division seems to undermine our ordinary understanding of the world around us. When we describe the apple as red and sweet, are we describing the apple or describing our experience of the apple? If secondary qualities are merely subjective additions to an otherwise colourless, tasteless, odourless world, then our rich perceptual experience becomes somehow less real than the mathematical abstractions of physics. The paradox deepens when we consider that even primary qualities might not be as objective as they initially appear. The shape of the apple depends on the scale at which we observe it, its boundaries becoming fuzzy at the molecular level. Its motion is relative to the observer's frame of reference. Even its extension might be observer-dependent in ways that relativity theory suggests. Perhaps the paradox of primary and secondary qualities reveals something profound about the relationship between mind and world, the way that reality emerges from the encounter between consciousness and whatever lies beyond consciousness. Maybe the sharp division between objective and subjective is itself an artifact of philosophical analysis rather than a genuine feature of experience. There is something beautifully mysterious about the way that perception creates the experienced world, the way that consciousness and reality collaborate to produce the rich tapestry of sensory experience. The paradox invites us to wonder at the miracle of perception, the way that waves and particles somehow become colours and sounds and tastes in the theatre of awareness. In contemplating this puzzle, we find ourselves at the intersection of philosophy of mind and philosophy of science, exploring questions about how the world of experience relates to the world described by physics. The mystery reminds us that even the simplest act of perception opens onto profound questions about the nature of reality itself. As we drift deeper into our exploration of philosophical mysteries, we encounter a paradox that touches the very foundations of logical reasoning. The paradox of the Raven's paradox presents us with a puzzle about confirmation and evidence that challenges our intuitive understanding of scientific method. Consider the hypothesis that all ravens are black, a statement that ornithologists might want to test through careful observation. The most natural way to gather evidence would be to observe ravens and note their colour. Each black raven we observe seems to provide some confirmation of the hypothesis, while a single non-black raven would decisively refute it. This straightforward approach aligns with our common sense about how evidence should work. But logic suggests that the statement "all ravens are black" is equivalent to "all non-black things are non-ravens." These are simply different ways of expressing the same logical relationship. If they are truly equivalent, then evidence supporting one should equally support the other. This means that observing a white shoe should provide evidence that all ravens are black, since the white shoe is indeed a non-black thing that is also a non-raven. The conclusion seems absurd. How could examining shoes in our closet tell us anything meaningful about the colour of birds? Yet the logical reasoning appears sound. The paradox reveals something puzzling about the relationship between formal logic and scientific reasoning, between abstract logical relationships and concrete evidential practices. Perhaps the puzzle points to something important about context and relevance in evidential reasoning. Maybe what counts as confirming evidence depends not just on logical relationships, but on background knowledge, research contexts, and practical considerations about where we are likely to find informative evidence. The paradox of the Raven's paradox invites us to consider the complex relationship between logic and scientific practice, between formal rules of reasoning and the actual methods scientists use to test their theories. There is something beautifully humbling about discovering that even our most careful logical analysis can lead to counterintuitive conclusions. In the gentle space between formal logic and practical reasoning, we find the ongoing challenge of understanding how evidence actually works in scientific inquiry. The paradox reminds us that reasoning about evidence is more complex and contextual than simple logical rules might suggest. Our journey through philosophical paradoxes now brings us to a puzzle that emerges from the realm of language and communication. The paradox of translation asks how genuine translation between languages is possible when different languages seem to carve up the world in fundamentally different ways. When we translate a poem from one language to another, what exactly are we preserving and what are we necessarily losing? Consider a simple word like home. In English, this typically refers to the place where one lives, but it carries emotional connotations of belonging, comfort, and identity that go far beyond mere location. Other languages have words that overlap with home, but capture different nuances of meaning, different aspects of the relationship between person and place. Some languages have multiple words for different kinds of dwelling, others embed assumptions about family structure or cultural practices that have no direct equivalent in English. The paradox suggests that genuine translation might be impossible, because languages do not simply provide different labels for the same underlying reality, but actually constitute different ways of experiencing and organizing that reality. To translate is not just to find equivalent words, but to bridge between different conceptual frameworks, different ways of being in the world. Yet translation clearly does occur, often with remarkable success. We read novels written in foreign languages, communicate across cultural boundaries, and find deep resonance with ideas expressed in languages we do not ourselves speak. Literature, philosophy, and science all depend on our ability to communicate meaningfully across linguistic boundaries. Perhaps the paradox of translation reveals something beautiful about both the diversity and unity of human experience. Maybe languages are different enough to make translation challenging and enriching, but similar enough to make it possible. Perhaps meaning is robust enough to survive the journey from one linguistic home to another while being transformed in the process. The paradox invites us to consider language not just as a tool for communication, but as a lens through which we perceive and structure reality. There is something deeply moving about the way that translation allows us to see the world through other eyes, to experience reality through the conceptual frameworks of other cultures and traditions. In contemplating the puzzle of translation, we find ourselves exploring the relationship between language and thought, between the words we use and the world we experience. The mystery reminds us that communication across difference is both more difficult and more miraculous than we might initially suppose. As we continue our gentle exploration, we encounter a paradox that touches the nature of mathematical truth and knowledge. The paradox of mathematical Platonism asks how we can have knowledge of mathematical objects if they exist independently of space, time, and causal interaction. Numbers, sets, and geometric figures seem to be discovered rather than invented, suggesting they exist in some objective realm, independent of human minds. Yet this Platonic realm of mathematical objects appears to be causally isolated from the physical world. Numbers cannot push or pull, sets cannot emit light or sound, geometric figures cannot interact with our sense organs. If mathematical objects exist independently of the physical world, it becomes mysterious how we can gain knowledge of them through our embodied, causally situated cognitive processes. The paradox deepens when we consider the remarkable applicability of mathematics to the physical world. The same mathematical structures that seem to exist in abstract isolation turn out to describe with uncanny precision the patterns and relationships we find in nature. How can abstract mathematical truths connect so intimately with concrete physical reality? Perhaps the paradox of mathematical Platonism reveals something important about the relationship between mind, mathematics, and world. Maybe mathematical objects are not isolated abstract entities, but patterns that emerge from the intersection of mental activity and natural structure. Perhaps mathematics is neither pure discovery nor pure invention, but something more mysterious, a collaborative creation between human reason and the rational structure of reality. The paradox invites us to wonder at the strange effectiveness of mathematics, the way that abstract reasoning about numbers and shapes provides such powerful tools for understanding the concrete world around us. There is something beautifully mysterious about the way that mathematical truth seems to transcend the particular minds that discover it, while remaining accessible to those minds. In contemplating this puzzle, we find ourselves exploring the relationship between abstract and concrete, between the world of ideas and the world of experience. The mystery reminds us that mathematical knowledge is both one of our greatest intellectual achievements and one of our deepest philosophical puzzles. Our philosophical wandering now brings us to a paradox that emerges from the intersection of knowledge and time. The paradox of temporal knowledge asks how we can have knowledge about the past or future when our cognitive access is limited to the present moment. When you remember what you had for breakfast this morning, or predict tomorrow's weather, what exactly is the object of your knowledge? The past no longer exists, having given way to the flowing present. The future does not yet exist, remaining open and undetermined. Yet we seem to have genuine knowledge about both temporal domains, knowledge that goes beyond mere present experience and reaches into times that are not now. Memory appears to provide access to past events, but the memory itself exists in the present, not in the past it purports to represent. How can a present mental state constitute knowledge of a non-existent past event? Similarly, our predictions about the future seem to be based on present evidence and reasoning, but they claim to describe states of affairs that do not yet obtain. The paradox suggests that temporal knowledge might be impossible, if only present things can serve as objects of knowledge. Yet we clearly do remember the past and anticipate the future in ways that seem genuinely cognitive rather than merely imaginative. Our entire framework of practical reasoning depends on our ability to learn from past experience and plan for future contingencies. Perhaps the paradox of temporal knowledge reveals something important about the nature of time and consciousness, the way that awareness spans temporal intervals rather than existing at mathematical instants. Maybe consciousness itself is inherently temporal, weaving past, present, and future into the unified fabric of experience. The paradox invites us to consider the mysterious relationship between time and knowledge, between the flowing nature of temporal experience and the seemingly timeless character of truth. There is something beautifully enigmatic about the way that memory and anticipation connect us to times beyond the present, while remaining grounded in present awareness. In contemplating this puzzle, we find ourselves exploring the temporal dimensions of consciousness and knowledge, the way that minds exist not just in time but across time. The mystery reminds us that temporal experience is one of the most fundamental yet puzzling existences. As Arling aspects of conscious gentle journey continues, we encounter a paradox that touches the nature of personal responsibility and collective action. The paradox of collective responsibility asks how groups can bear moral responsibility when groups are composed of individuals who each play only a small part in collective outcomes. When a corporation causes environmental damage or a nation wages an unjust war, who exactly is responsible? Individual employees or citizens typically contribute only minimally to large-scale collective actions. The environmental damage would occur even if any particular individual acted differently. The war would continue even if any single citizen protested. Each person's contribution seems too small to make a difference, yet the collective outcome clearly involves moral responsibility that must somehow be distributed among the participants. The paradox deepens when we consider that collective actions often produce results that no individual intended or foresaw. The environmental damage might result from countless individual decisions that were perfectly reasonable when considered in isolation. The unjust war might emerge from institutional dynamics that transcend the intentions of any particular decision-maker. Yet something in us rebels against the suggestion that collective responsibility dissolves into individual innocence. Large-scale harm requires some form of accountability. Moral communities need mechanisms for addressing systemic wrongdoing, and individuals must somehow be connected to the collective enterprises in which they participate. Perhaps the paradox of collective responsibility reveals something important about the social dimensions of moral life, the way that responsibility is not just an individual property, but emerges from relationships, institutions, and shared practices. Maybe moral responsibility is more like a web than a collection of isolated points, more like a shared conversation than a series of individual statements. The paradox invites us to consider how individual agency relates to collective outcomes, how personal responsibility connects to social and institutional processes. There is something deeply challenging about living ethically in a world where our actions are embedded in complex social systems, whose overall effects we cannot fully control or predict. In contemplating this puzzle, we find ourselves exploring the intersection of individual and collective ethics, the way that personal moral life is shaped by and shapes the larger communities in which we participate. The mystery reminds us that responsibility is both individual and collective, both personal and social. Our philosophical exploration now brings us to a paradox that emerges from the realm of aesthetics and artistic value. The paradox of aesthetic judgment asks how judgments about beauty and artistic merit can be both subjective and universal. When you declare that a particular painting is beautiful or a piece of music is moving, you seem to be making a claim about your own subjective response. Yet you also seem to expect others to share your judgment, as if beauty were an objective property that rational observers should recognize. The paradox begins with the observation that aesthetic judgments feel different from mere expressions of personal preference. When you say you like chocolate ice cream, you typically do not expect everyone to agree or think that those who prefer vanilla are making some kind of mistake. But when you call a sunset beautiful or a poem profound, you seem to be making a claim that goes beyond mere personal taste. Yet aesthetic judgments also seem irreducibly subjective, in ways that factual judgments are not. There is no scientific test for beauty, no objective measurement of artistic value. People with similar backgrounds and education can disagree profoundly about aesthetic matters without either party seeming obviously mistaken or irrational. The paradox suggests that aesthetic judgment occupies a peculiar middle ground between objective fact and subjective preference. Perhaps beauty is neither purely objective nor purely subjective, but something more complex, a response that emerges from the meeting between consciousness and certain features of the world. Maybe the paradox of aesthetic judgment reveals something important about the nature of value itself, the way that significance and meaning arise from the interaction between minds and world rather than existing independently in either domain. Perhaps aesthetic experience is a form of collaborative creation between perceiver and perceived. The paradox invites us to wonder at the mystery of aesthetic response, the way that certain combinations of colour, sound, word, and form can move us profoundly while others leave us cold. There is something beautifully enigmatic about the way that aesthetic experience connects us to beauty, while remaining grounded in our particular perspective and sensibility. In contemplating this puzzle, we find ourselves exploring the relationship between subjective experience and objective value, between personal response and universal significance. The mystery reminds us that aesthetic judgment is both deeply personal and somehow more than merely personal, both individual and universal. As we drift deeper into our philosophical journey, we encounter a paradox that touches the very nature of existence and identity. The paradox of constitution asks how the same matter can simultaneously constitute different objects with different properties. Consider a bronze statue of a warrior. The bronze and the statue seem to occupy the same space and be composed of the same atoms, yet they have different properties and different conditions of existence. The bronze could survive being melted down and reformed into a bowl, but the statue could not. The statue has aesthetic properties and historical significance that the bronze, considered merely as material, does not possess. If they are identical, how can they have different properties? If they are distinct, how can they occupy exactly the same space and be made of exactly the same matter? The paradox extends beyond artistic objects to living beings and their bodies, persons and their physical forms, organizations and their members. In each case, we seem to have two things that are intimately connected yet somehow distinct, sharing all their matter yet possessing different properties and following different principles of identity over time. Perhaps the paradox of constitution reveals something profound about the relationship between form and matter, between organization and substance. Maybe identity is not just about what something is made of, but about how it is organized, not just about material composition, but about structural and functional properties. The paradox invites us to consider how emergence and organization create new levels of reality, how the same underlying matter can support multiple levels of description and identity. There is something beautifully mysterious about the way that organization transforms matter, creating new entities with new properties while remaining grounded in more basic physical processes. In contemplating this puzzle, we find ourselves exploring the relationship between parts and wholes, between material and formal properties. The mystery reminds us that reality itself might be layered, supporting multiple valid descriptions and multiple genuine entities at different levels of organization. Our gentle exploration now brings us to a paradox that emerges from the intersection of freedom and determinism. The paradox of libertarian free will asks how genuine freedom of choice is possible in a world where every event has sufficient causes. If our decisions emerge from prior causes according to natural laws, they seem determined rather than free. But if they are not caused by prior events, they seem random rather than genuinely chosen. The paradox presents us with an uncomfortable dilemma. Either our choices are the inevitable results of prior causes, in which case we are not truly responsible for them, or they are uncaused events that happen to us rather than actions we perform. Neither option seems to preserve the kind of ultimate responsibility that moral and legal practices seem to require, yet our experience of choice feels fundamentally different from our experience of merely observing determined events or random occurrences. When we deliberate about important decisions, we experience ourselves as agents capable of selecting among genuine alternatives based on reasons and values. This experience of agency seems central to our self-understanding as rational, responsible beings. Perhaps the paradox of libertarian free will reveals something important about the relationship between causal explanation and a genteel understanding, between viewing ourselves as objects in the natural world and experiencing ourselves as subjects capable of action. Maybe freedom and determinism operate at different levels of description, rather than being incompatible claims about the same phenomena. The paradox invites us to consider how responsibility and agency can be preserved in a natural world governed by causal laws. There is something beautifully mysterious about the way that we experience ourselves as free agents even while recognizing our embeddedness in the causal order of nature. In contemplating this puzzle, we find ourselves exploring one of the oldest and deepest questions in philosophy, the relationship between human freedom and natural necessity. The mystery reminds us that our experience of agency is both undeniable and deeply puzzling, both central to our self-understanding and difficult to reconcile with our scientific worldview. As we continue our philosophical wandering, we encounter a paradox that touches the nature of consciousness and other minds. The paradox of other minds asks how we can ever know that other people are conscious rather than sophisticated biological machines that exhibit all the outward signs of consciousness without any inner experience. When you see someone smile or hear them express joy, how do you know they are actually experiencing happiness rather than simply executing programmed responses? The paradox begins with the observation that consciousness seems irreducibly private and subjective. You have direct access to your own experiences but can only observe the external behavior of others. No amount of behavioral evidence can definitively establish that consciousness accompanies that behavior, since it seems logically possible for all the same behaviors to occur without any accompanying inner experience. Yet our entire social world is built on the assumption that other people are conscious beings like ourselves, that they experience pain and pleasure, hope and fear, love and longing. We hold them responsible for their actions, form emotional bonds with them, and structure our moral and political institutions around the recognition of their consciousness and agency. The paradox suggests that either our belief in other minds is unjustified, based on an illegitimate inference from behavior to consciousness, or that consciousness is not as private and inaccessible as it initially appears to be. Perhaps the very concept of consciousness as purely private inner experience is problematic. Maybe the paradox of other minds reveals something important about the social nature of consciousness itself, the way that minds are not isolated inner realms but emerge from and exist within communities of interaction and recognition. Perhaps consciousness is not discovered but acknowledged, not inferred but encountered in the meeting between persons. The paradox invites us to consider how we recognize and relate to other conscious beings, how the assumption of other minds shapes our social and moral lives. There is something beautifully mysterious about the way that we encounter consciousness in others without being able to observe it directly, recognizing minds through the subtle dance of interaction and response. In contemplating this puzzle, we find ourselves exploring the social dimensions of consciousness, the way that minds exist not in isolation but in relationship with other minds. The mystery reminds us that consciousness itself might be as much about connection as it is about inner experience. These philosophical paradoxes we have encountered tonight continue to weave their way through the deepest questions of human existence, revealing the beautiful complexity that underlies our most basic concepts and experiences. They show us that reality is far more mysterious and nuanced than our everyday thinking might suggest, that even our most careful philosophical analysis encounters limits and generates new puzzles. As our gentle journey through the landscape of paradox continues, remember that these puzzles are not problems demanding urgent solutions, but companions for contemplation, invitations to rest in wonder rather than struggle with confusion. They offer us permission to embrace uncertainty as a doorway to deeper understanding, to find peace in questions that remain beautifully open. Let these philosophical mysteries settle softly in your awareness like dewdrops on morning grass, each one reflecting the light of understanding while remaining mysteriously itself. The realm of paradox stretches endlessly around us, filled with wonders that illuminate the depths of reality while reminding us that the deepest truths often lie beyond the reach of final comprehension. Our philosophical wandering now brings us to a paradox that emerges from the curious realm of moral emotions and rational judgment. The paradox of moral sentiments asks how our feelings about right and wrong can be both deeply personal responses and sources of objective moral knowledge. When you witness an act of cruelty and feel a surge of moral indignation, is this emotion merely a subjective reaction, or is it actually revealing something true about the moral nature of the situation? The puzzle begins with the observation that moral emotions seem to carry a special kind of authority. When we feel guilt about our own actions or outrage about injustice, these emotions feel different from mere preferences or arbitrary reactions. They seem to track something real about moral value, to respond to genuine features of the moral landscape, rather than simply reflecting our personal psychology or cultural conditioning. Yet emotions are notoriously unreliable guides to truth in other domains. Fear can be irrational, anger can be misplaced, love can be blind to its object's genuine qualities. If emotions are generally poor sources of knowledge about the world, why should moral emotions be any different? Perhaps moral indignation tells us more about our psychological makeup than about objective moral facts. The paradox deepens when we consider that moral emotions seem to motivate moral action in ways that purely rational moral judgment cannot. Knowledge that something is wrong might inform our decisions, but it is often moral feeling that moves us to act. The person who risks their safety to help a stranger seems driven not just by abstract principles, but by immediate emotional response to suffering. Maybe the paradox of moral sentiments reveals something profound about the relationship between reason and emotion in moral life, the way that ethical understanding emerges not from pure rational analysis, but but from the integration of thought and feeling. Perhaps moral emotions are not obstacles to moral knowledge, but essential components of it, ways of being attuned to moral reality that complement and complete rational reflection. There is something beautifully human about the way that morality engages our whole being, not just our capacity for abstract reasoning, but our to feel, to be moved, to respond with our entire emotional and motivational apparatus. The paradox invites us to consider whether moral knowledge might be as much about emotional wisdom as intellectual understanding. In the gentle space between feeling and thinking, between emotional response and rational analysis, we find the rich complexity of moral experience. The mystery reminds us that ethics is not just an intellectual discipline but a lived practice that engages all dimensions of human experience and understanding. As we drift deeper into our exploration of philosophical mysteries, we encounter a paradox that touches the nature of language and private experience. The paradox of private language asks whether it is possible to have a language that refers to private, inner experiences that only the speaker can access. When you name your own sensations, emotions, or thoughts, are you using genuine linguistic expressions or merely making private associations that cannot constitute real language? Consider the simple act of giving a name to a particular type of pain you experience. You might call it that sharp stabbing feeling, and use this phrase consistently to refer to similar sensations. Yet, how can you be sure you're using the term correctly? In public language, correctness is established through agreement with other speakers, but with private sensations, no one else can check whether your usage is consistent or appropriate. The paradox suggests that genuine language requires public criteria for correctness, shared standards that allow speakers to distinguish between correct and incorrect usage. But private experiences seem to lack these public criteria, being accessible only to the person who has them. This creates a puzzle about whether private language is genuinely possible, or whether all meaningful language must ultimately be grounded in shared, public phenomena. Yet our inner lives feel linguistically rich and meaningful. We think in words, describe our experiences to ourselves, and seem to use language meaningfully to organize and understand our private mental worlds. The stream of consciousness appears to be genuinely linguistic, not merely a series of unlabeled experiences or wordless impressions. Perhaps the paradox of private language reveals something important about the social nature of meaning, the way that even our most private uses of language depend on patterns and practices that we learned in community with others. Maybe the distinction between private and public language is not as sharp as it initially appears, with private usage remaining tethered to public linguistic practices. The paradox invites us to consider how language bridges the gap between inner and outer worlds, how public linguistic practices make private experience expressible and shareable. There is something deeply intriguing about the way that language seems to inhabit both personal and social spaces, connecting our private thoughts to shared forms of expression and understanding. In contemplating this puzzle, we find ourselves exploring the relationship between individual consciousness and social communication, between private experience and public meaning. The mystery reminds us that language itself is one of the most remarkable features of human existence, somehow managing to make the private public and the personal universal. Our journey through philosophical paradoxes now brings us to a puzzle that emerges from the intersection of knowledge and action. The paradox of practical reason asks how we can rationally move from beliefs about what is the case to decisions about what we ought to do. The gap between descriptive knowledge and normative action seems to resist bridging through rational inference alone. Consider a simple case of practical reasoning. You believe that exercise promotes health, you desire to be healthy, and you conclude that you ought to exercise. This seems like straightforward rational inference, yet closer examination reveals puzzling gaps. How does factual knowledge about the effects of exercise combine with a desire for health to generate a normative conclusion about what you should do? The move from is to ought appears to require something beyond pure logical reasoning. Facts alone seem incapable of generating obligations, yet practical reason seems to require precisely this kind of normative inference. Perhaps desires, values, or commitments must enter the reasoning process, but then practical reason becomes less like objective rational calculation and more like subjective preference satisfaction. And so we reach the gentle end of our philosophical wandering, having travelled together through the soft landscape of paradox and wonder that has captivated human minds for millennia. Tonight, we have encountered contradictions that shimmer like mirages at the edges of understanding, puzzles that reveal the beautiful complexity hidden beneath our everyday experience of thinking, knowing, and being. From the ancient riddle of the heap to the modern mysteries of consciousness and meaning, these paradoxes have shown us that reality is far richer and more mysterious than our initial assumptions might suggest. They remind us that the most profound questions often have no easy answers, that wisdom sometimes lies not in resolution, but in the patient contemplation of beautiful impossibilities. As your thoughts begin to soften and your breathing deepens, let these philosophical mysteries settle gently in your awareness like stars reflecting on still water. Each paradox we have explored tonight is an invitation to embrace uncertainty, not as confusion, but as wonder, to find peace in questions that remain eternally open to contemplation. Whether you drift off remembering Zeno's racing tortoise, the Ship of Theseus sailing through time, or Russell's impossible set, carry with you the knowledge that these contradictions are not problems to be solved but companions for the journey into deeper understanding. They teach us that reality is more nuanced than our concepts can capture, that existence itself is a mystery worthy of lifelong wonder. So rest now, gentle philosopher, knowing that in embracing these paradoxes you have touched something essential about the human condition, our endless capacity for curiosity, and our beautiful willingness to dwell peacefully within the vast mystery of being. Sweet dreams, and may your sleep be filled with the quiet wisdom of questions that have no final answers but infinite depth for contemplation.